is Lady Boulay, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we have another fascinating subject: why the 13th Amendment is more important or carries more weight than the Emancipation Proclamation. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. The country was already in a great turmoil. The turmoil or conflict was between the northern states and the southern states. The cause of the conflict was slavery. The North, especially the abolitionists, wanted the government to abolish slavery, and the South wanted the government to leave it alone. With Lincoln's election, the South believed that he would indeed end slavery. We must remember that the wealth in the country at that time was in the South. The cotton industry generated more money than all of the other industries in the country put together. So the South was willing to fight to keep slavery as an industry. But the North was equally determined. They wanted slavery to end. The abolitionists were pressuring the government to end slavery, and they were aggressively working to help slaves escape out of the South and into the North. This infuriated the South. Their anger rose to the level that in December of 1860, 3 months after Abraham Lincoln was elected president, the South began leaving the United States, or the Union as it was called. 11 slave-holding states left the Union to form their own country. They were South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, Florida, Tennessee, Louisiana, Virginia, Arkansas, and Texas. The new country they formed was called the Confederate States of America. They elected their own president, Jefferson Davis, coined their own money, and set their own laws. It is important to note that 4 slave-holding states did not leave the Union. Those 4 states were Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Because they did not leave the Union, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, it greatly affected the slaves living in those border states. The Confederate States were determined to govern themselves, and they knew this meant war. So on April 12th of 1861, they fired on Fort Sumter, a Union installation in South Carolina, and this began the Civil War. When the Civil War began, the institution of slavery was hanging in the balance. Everyone understood that the outcome of the war would determine the outcome of slavery. In the first year of the Civil War, the South was winning. They won all of the major battles. They routed the North in several cases, and in other cases, they totally neutralized them. They became so confident in their fighting skills that they started pushing into the North. Their goal was to capture Washington, D.C., the Union capital, and capture the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was desperate for a win. If the South succeeded in accomplishing their goal, it would be a disaster. The country would be divided forever, slavery would remain intact, and he almost certainly would not have been re-elected for a second term. Historians battle back and forth about what the Civil War was about. Some say it was about slavery, some say it wasn't, and we can only imagine what the slaves thought as they listened in the background. What is not in question is the commander of the Confederate Army, General Robert E. Lee. He was a skilled tactician, he was a strategist, and he was a fierce warrior. Abraham Lincoln wanted him to lead the Union Army, but Robert E. Lee was from Virginia, and he said he could not raise a hand against Virginia, and so he led the Confederate Army. Well, he was a formidable opponent. Abraham Lincoln was disappointed with the Union generals, and he was still looking for a general who could match Robert E. Lee's fighting skills and his fighting spirit. In September of 1862, Robert E. Lee and his Confederate Army had pushed their way into Maryland, which is close to Washington, D.C. Now, the Union Army, with their backs against the wall, had to take a stand. On September 17th of 1862, a bloody battle was fought near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. Both the North and the South experienced heavy casualties. It is said to be the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. But at the end of the battle, the advantage went to the North. Abraham Lincoln knew that this was his time to make a move. He wanted to keep troop morale high, their spirits high, and he wanted the country to rally behind the war. So this is when he and his cabinet began discussing Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22nd of 1862, 5 days after the battle at Sharpsburg, Abraham Lincoln signed into law the Emancipation Proclamation. It said that on January 1st of 1863, all of the slaves living in states in rebellion against the United States would be free. This caused a great celebration for those slaves living in the states that were in rebellion against the United States. But the slaves that were living in the four border states that were not in rebellion against the United States were not free. So that was the first problem with the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free all of the slaves. The second problem with the Emancipation Proclamation is that it was an executive order. An executive order is only as good as the president that signed it into law. If a new president comes into office and disagrees with any executive order that the president before him signed into law, he can overturn it. And we have seen that with President Donald Trump. He has overturned just about every executive order that President Obama signed into law. Therefore, if the president that was elected after Abraham Lincoln had been pro-slavery, all he would have had to do was to overturn the Emancipation Proclamation, and those that had been freed would be right back in slavery. I think I should point out at this time that Abraham Lincoln's goal was not to free the slaves. His goal was to save the Union. In his own words, he said, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all of the slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that." So he wanted to save the Union. He wanted to bring those 11 states that had withdrawn from the Union and gone off and formed their own country back into the Union, the United States. He wanted them back. The Emancipation Proclamation was not binding legislation, but for those living in slavery in the United States of America in the fall of 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation was all they had, and it was enough. They got the word through the Telenegro grapevine that they were going to be free on January 1st of 1863, and they were sitting already. The story comes down to us as descendants of slaves that there was great jubilation in the air. They were waiting with tears in their eyes, laughter in their hearts, and hope in their souls for a better day. So on December 31st of 1862, New Year's Eve, the slaves went out into the woods or wherever their worship place was, and they waited and they watched. They sang, they danced, they prayed, they cried, they laughed, they ate, but most of all, they watched the night sky. That was how they told time, by the movements in the sky. And when the time came that they knew the old year had passed and the new year had come, they knew that they were free. And some of those slaves got their little knapsacks and walked away from those plantations. Many of the ex-slaves joined the Union Army, In their minds, they were still fighting against slavery. It is stunning to report that over 180,000 slaves, ex-slaves, and free blacks joined the Union Army. With this new infusion of fighting spirit, the Union Army caught fire. 1863 brought more fierce fighting and thousands of casualties. Some of the most violent battles of the Civil War were fought in 1863, including the Battle of Chancellorsville, the Battle of Fort Wagner. This was the battle in which the 54th Massachusetts Infantry were engaged in heavy fighting. It was the most famous battle that African Americans participated in during the Civil War, and also the battle that the movie Glory was made about. Two of Frederick Douglass's sons and one of Sojourner Truth's grandsons were involved in this battle. 1863 brought other famous battles. The siege at Vicksburg, Mississippi, which resulted in a victory for the Union Army, and then the big prize, Gettysburg. Gettysburg is the most celebrated battle of the Civil War, and it marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. The battle waged for 3 bloody days, but at the end of the 3rd day, the North had soundly defeated the South. General Robert E. Lee and his Confederate Army were in retreat. The Confederate Army tried to recover and renew their strength, but they didn't have the resources to match the resources of the North. They didn't have the money, they didn't have the food, and most importantly, they didn't have the men. The Union Army was continuing to enlist new men, including immigrants, whereas the Confederate Army was not. When they lost a unit, that unit was gone forever. 1864 was a bloodbath, but the Union Army was continuing to gain ground. They pushed their way into the South, pillaging, plundering, and burning as they went. This was truly a tragic time in the United States of America. The Confederate Army was still a fighting force, but the glory of the old days when they were routing armies and winning battles were over. Finally, on April 9th of 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Confederate Army to the commander of the Union Army, General Ulysses S. Grant. So after 4 years of bloody fighting, the North had won the war. Now the Civil War was over, the bloodbath had ended, and the country could begin bringing itself back together. The big question now was what to do about the executive order, the Emancipation Proclamation, and what to do about slavery. By now, the Congress of the United States realized that slavery had to be abolished. On April the 8th of 1864, the Senate had already passed the 13th Amendment. The House passed it on January 31st of 1865, and on December the 6th of 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, freeing the slaves, was passed into law. Now, there was true celebration and vindication for those whose foreparents had been brought into this country for hundreds of years on slave ships and doomed them to a life of bondage. Now they could celebrate as free citizens of the United States of America. And this brings us to the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution freed the slaves. It freed all of them. An amendment to the Constitution is not an executive order, so a new president cannot come in and overturn an amendment. It is binding legislation. It takes the Congress of the United States of America to approve an amendment, and it takes the Congress of the United States to repeal an amendment. It takes 2/3 vote in the House of Representatives and a 2/3 vote in the House of Senate to approve an amendment or to repeal an amendment. So repealing an amendment is very difficult. I have to add that the other way to repeal or approve an amendment to the Constitution of the United States is that 3/4 of the states of the United States have to agree. That's 38 states. That's also very hard to do. So when the 13th Amendment passed, the slaves could rest assured that they were free. So the 13th Amendment is a more important document than the Emancipation Proclamation because it is binding legislation. It cannot be overturned because one person doesn't agree with it. As an African American, I would feel remiss in not adding this very last footnote about the watch meeting that the slaves had in the woods on New Year's Eve of 1862. It's a part of our culture and is something that I would like to share. The ceremony in which the slaves went into the woods or their worship places on New Year's Eve of 1862 to watch the old year out and the new year end and freedom, that ceremony is called watch meeting. And many African Americans still observe watch meeting. On December 31st of every year, New Year's Eve, we go to our worship places. We sing, we pray, we preach, we dance, and we praise God for delivering our ancestors from slavery. My final thoughts on this subject is a reflection. In my research, I came across the picture of a woman who was a slave in Massachusetts in the 18th century. Her name was Elizabeth Freeman. She was the first slave woman to sue for her freedom, and she won. In speaking about her slave experience, she said, "Any time while I was a slave, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I had been told I must die at the end of that minute, I would have taken it. Just to stand 1 minute on God's earth, a free woman, I would have taken it." These 155 years after slavery, sometimes it is hard for us to remember how difficult it must have been for our people during that horrible time in this country. But this slave woman says that she would rather have 1 minute of freedom than a lifetime of slavery. That is quite something. Think on that.